That summer afternoon in Oak Haven Valley, a gunshot cracked outside Clara Vance's little schoolhouse. Sign the papers. Teacher, or the boy pays for your stubbornness, the masked rider snarled, gripping young Tobias by the collar. Clara's face went pale, but she still stood between the outlaw and her students. Please, she whispered, her voice shaking. Take the well if you must. Just let the child go. Then a rifle clicked from inside the dust storm. A tall stranger stepped into view, hat low, eyes cold. Let him go, Silas Thorne said, before I make that choice for you. And that was the moment one schoolteacher, one haunted gunslinger, and one stolen well pulled the whole valley into a fight no one would forget. Stay with the story until the end. The dust came first. It always did. Clara Vance felt it before she saw it, a pressure change in the air, grit stinging her eyes as she herded the last of her students toward the schoolhouse door. The sky had gone the color of a bruise, brown and low, swallowing the horizon whole. Inside now, she called out. Leave the slates. Just go. 12 children scrambled past her, their small hands clutching at her skirt as they went. She counted heads out of habit. 6 boys, 6 girls, all accounted for. It was the counting that kept her sane most days. The counting and the maps she drew at night. The only 2 things in her life that added up to something certain. The gunfire came a moment later. Not a warning shot, not the kind fired into the air to scare off coyotes. This was close, deliberate, aimed at the windmill that pumped water up from the well beneath her land. Clara spun toward the sound and saw them. 4 riders, dust masks pulled up over their faces. One already dismounted and swinging an axe handle at the windmill's base. She knew who sent them. Everyone in the valley knew who sent them. Get away from that well, she shouted, running toward the man with the axe handle before her mind had caught up with her feet. It was not bravery. It was arithmetic. That well was the only water for 11 miles. Without it, the school closed. Without the school, these children went back to nothing. The gang's leader turned at her voice. He was older than the others, with pale eyes and a way of moving that suggested he had done this before, many times, in many towns. He did not reach for his gun. He reached for a boy instead, the smallest of her students, a 7-year-old named Tobias, who had wandered too close, trying to see what the commotion was. Teach here long, the man asked, dragging Tobias by the collar. The boy's face had gone white with fear, his mouth open but no sound coming out. Clara stopped running. Something in her chest went cold and still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Let him go, she said. Sign the papers my boss sent you. Sign them and walk away. Then I let him go. She had seen the papers, forged, every line of them. Her father's signature, copied so poorly a child could spot the difference. She knew what signing meant. It meant Malachi Stone owned her well by sundown, and every rancher downstream owned nothing but dust by spring. But the boy was crying now, silent tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face. And Clara understood in that moment that principle was a luxury she could not afford. Not with his collar twisted in a stranger's fist. She dropped to her knees in the sand. The wind screamed around her, throwing grit into her mouth, her eyes, but she did not look away from the man holding Tobias. I beg you, she said, and her voice cracked in a way she hated. Stop, please. Take the papers. Take anything. Just let him go. The wind shifted. It happened all at once, the way weather does out on the plains. One direction giving way to another without warning. A wall of dust rolled between Clara and the gang, thick enough to blot out the sun, and for a moment nobody could see more than a few feet in any direction. Then came the sound, a sharp metallic clack, unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around firearms. A lever-action rifle being worked, smooth and unhurried, like a man setting a table for supper. The axe handle in the first man's grip shattered into splinters. He had not even seen the shot coming, had not seen anything but dust. And now his weapon lay in pieces at his feet while he stood there, stupid with shock. Out of the swirling brown haze walked a stranger. He was tall, built lean the way men get when hard living strips away everything but muscle and bone. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes that gave nothing away. The Winchester rested easy in his hands, not aimed at anyone yet, just held, the way a man holds something he trusts completely. He did not speak. He did not need to. The gang's leader loosened his grip on Tobias, weighing his odds, and found them wanting. 4 against 1 should have favored him. But something about the stranger's stillness said the math did not work that way. Not with him. He shoved the boy toward Clara and backed toward his horse, calling for his men to mount up. Within a minute, they were gone, swallowed by the same dust storm that had carried the stranger in. Clara pulled Tobias into her arms, checking him for injury, finding none but a torn collar and a fright that would likely visit his dreams for weeks. Around them, the other children crept back out to see, faces pressed to windows, then the doorway, then finally spilling into the yard. The stranger lowered his rifle. He looked at the schoolhouse, the well. The children clustered around their teacher like chicks around a hen. Something crossed his face, brief and unreadable, gone before Clara could name it. "You hurt?" he asked. His voice was rough, unused to speaking. "Maybe." "No," she said, still holding Tobias. "Thanks to you." He nodded once. Like that settled a debt somewhere in his own accounting. Then he turned to walk back toward the horse he had left, tied at the edge of the schoolyard, as if his part in this was already finished. Clara watched him go and understood, without knowing why, that it was not finished at all. Doc Joe Miller's clinic smelled like carbolic soap and coffee that had been on the stove too long. Silas Thorne sat on the edge of an exam table, shirt off, letting the doctor pick gravel out of a shallow cut on his shoulder. He had not asked for help. She had simply pointed at the table and told him to sit. And something about her tone made arguing feel like more trouble than it was worth. "You're going to have a scar," Joe said, dabbing at the wound. "Got plenty already." She glanced at his back, at the old marks crossing his skin like a map of every bad decision he had ever made or had made for him, and said nothing about it. That was one thing Silas noticed about her right away. She looked at a man's wounds and treated them. She did not ask him to explain how he got them. Through the open door, he could hear Clara's voice in the next room, low and steady, talking to the children while she checked them over one by one. No one was hurt bad. A few scrapes, a lot of fright. But she went to each child anyway, crouching down to their level, asking questions in a voice that made the whole ordeal sound like something they had gotten through together, instead of something that had almost gone very wrong. "You're all right," she told Tobias, wrapping a strip of clean cloth around his elbow, even though the skin beneath was barely broken. "You did exactly right, staying still like that. That took nerve." The boy straightened up a little at the words, chest puffing out, and Silas found himself watching through the doorway longer than he meant to. "She does that with all of them," Joe said, following his gaze. "Tells them they did something brave, even when all they did was get scared and stand there. Half those kids never heard a kind word from an adult before she opened that school. Where do they come from? Some got no folks left. Some got folks that can't feed them or don't want the bother. She takes them in, teaches them letters and numbers, teaches them they're worth something. Only school like it for 200 miles, and it's free. On account of that well on her land, which is exactly why Malachi Stone wants it gone." Silas said nothing. He had heard plenty of names in his line of work, names that made grown men change the subject fast. Malachi Stone was not one he knew personally, but the type was familiar enough. Men who counted the cost of a life in dollars and found it came up short every time. Joe finished with his shoulder and stepped back. "You planning to ride out at first light? Wasn't planning on staying. Didn't ask what you were planning. Asked if you still meant to do it." He did not answer that either. Through the door, Clara had moved on to the next child, and the next, patient as anything, her hands gentle, even though her voice never lost its edge of steel. Silas had spent 15 years learning how to read a person's intentions from the way they carried themselves. Clara Vance carried herself like someone who had decided a long time ago that Giving up was simply not an option worth considering, no matter what it cost her. He pulled his shirt back on and walked out to the porch. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a hard, clean blue. The kind that only comes after a bad wind has scoured everything else away. He sat on the porch step and rolled a cigarette he did not light, just held between his fingers. A habit left over from nights when the smell of tobacco was the only thing that reminded him he was still alive. The door creaked behind him. Clara stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, and sat down on the step beside him without asking if he minded. "I never got your name," she said. "Silas Thorne, mister." "Thorne, I owe you my life and the life of one of my students. I'd like to pay that debt somehow, if you'll let me." "Don't need paying. I didn't ask what you needed. I'm offering." He glanced at her sideways. She had dirt on her cheek, and her hair had come loose from its pins in the wind, and there was a steadiness in her eyes that made him think of deep water, the kind that looks calm on the surface but runs a long way down. "I found a document," she said, "a foreclosure notice with my father's signature on it, except my father's been dead 3 years. And that signature is wrong. Somebody forged it. I need to get to the county records office to prove it, but the road runs through Country Stone's men control. And after today, I don't think I can make that trip alone. Get the sheriff. The sheriff works for Stone, same as everybody else who wants to keep breathing in this town." She said it plainly. No bitterness in it, just fact. "I have money. Not much, but enough. $5 a day. And I'll feed you besides, if you'll ride with me to the records office and back." Silas turned the unlit cigarette over in his fingers. Every instinct built up over 15 years of hard living told him to say no. Attachments got people killed, his own and worse, other people's. He had learned that lesson in blood more than once. But he thought of the boy with the torn collar, straightening his shoulders, because a woman had told him he was brave. He thought of a schoolhouse full of children nobody else wanted, kept alive by one stubborn will and one stubborn woman who would not back down even with a gun pointed at a child's head. $5 a day, he said, and you don't ask me questions I don't want to answer. Agreed. Then I'll ride with you. She held out her hand to shake on it, the way a man would, and he took it, surprised at the strength in her grip. Calluses on her palm, ink stains on 2 of her fingers. Not the hands of someone who had lived soft. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What'd you expect? Someone who'd want more than $5 a day for putting himself between me and Malachi Stone's men. Money's not why I did it." "I know," she said. "That's what surprises me." She stood, brushing off her skirt, and looked back toward the schoolhouse, where the children were being gathered by Joe's sister. "For the walk home. We leave at dawn. I'll have breakfast ready." Silas watched her go, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself looking forward to morning instead of just enduring it. That night he slept in the hayloft above Doc Joe's small barn, and for once the dreams that usually came, the gunfire and the screaming and the faces of men he had put in the ground, stayed quiet. He woke before sunrise anyway, old habits refusing to break, and sat in the loft door, watching the stars fade out one by one. He thought about riding on. It would have been easy. Saddle the horse, leave a note, be 40 miles gone before Clara Vance ever woke to find her breakfast getting cold. It was the kind of thing he had done a dozen times before, in a dozen other towns, whenever a place started to feel like somewhere he might want to stay. But he thought of her, kneeling in the dust, begging for a child's life instead of her own. And he understood something about her that most men never bothered to understand about anyone. Her strength was not in the fact that she never felt afraid. It was in the fact that she acted anyway, fear and all. That kind of courage was rare enough that a man might want to stand near it a while longer, just to see what it built. He climbed down from the loft as the sky began to lighten, and went to find his horse. The ledger sat open on the small table in Clara's kitchen, pages of her father's careful bookkeeping running alongside the forged document she had pulled from the county clerk's files. She had spent 3 nights comparing them line by line, and now, in the lamplight, She finally saw the pattern. "Here," she said, sliding the papers towards Silas. "Look at the letter S. My father always closed it at the top, like this. Whoever forged this left it open. Every single time." Silas leaned over the table, studying the two signatures side by side. He was no expert in penmanship, but even he could see it once she pointed it out. "Somebody who knew him well enough to copy most of it," he said, "but not well enough to catch the small things. That narrows it considerably. It has to be someone with regular access to his old letters and documents." Clara's jaw tightened. "Someone in the county office. Your uncle." She did not answer right away. Elias Vance had never been a brave man. Not once in Clara's memory. But she had never thought him a criminal either. Weak, yes, easily frightened. But not someone who would sell out his own family for money. "I don't want to believe it," she said finally. "But he's the only one who had both the access and the reason." "What reason?" "Debt. He's been in debt to Stone's bank for 2 years. I always assumed Stone let it slide out of some scrap of decency. Now I wonder if decency had anything to do with it." Silas said nothing, but something in his face told her he had seen this particular kind of arrangement before. Men who called in debts not with money, but with favors that cost a person their conscience one small piece at a time. Word came the next evening from Doc Joe's sister, who worked the telegraph office and heard most things before anyone else in town. Elias Vance had booked passage on the midnight mail stage, traveling light, telling no one where he was headed. "He's running," Clara said. "Then we catch him before he's gone." The night was moonless, clouds thick overhead, the kind of dark that swallowed the road whole. Silas knew the route the stage would take, a long stretch of flat prairie where a rider could get ahead of it if he pushed his horse hard enough and knew which draws to cut through. Clara rode beside him without complaint, though he could tell. By the way, she gripped the reins that riding fast in the dark was not something she was used to. They reached the crossing an hour before the stage was due, and Silas positioned their horses in the brush off the road, close enough to see, far enough not to spook the driver into anything reckless. "When it stops," he said, "you let me go first. He's my uncle, not a bandit. Man running from something he's ashamed of can be more dangerous than a bandit. Bandits know what they are. Ashamed men don't always know what they'll do to keep hiding it." Clara did not argue further, though Silas could see she did not much like being told to stay back. It was becoming clear to him that she did not like being told anything. Not from a place of stubbornness exactly, but from a lifetime of having to make her own decisions because no one else was going to make them for her. The stage came rattling out of the dark right on schedule, lanterns swinging on either side of the driver's box. Silas stepped his horse out into the road and raised a hand, and the driver hauled back on the reins hard enough to make the team stamp and blow. "Evening," Silas said, voice even. "Need a word with your passenger." The driver, an older man with a shotgun across his knees, looked Silas over and seemed to decide the trouble was not worth dying for. "He's the only one aboard tonight. Ain't looking for a fight over him." Clara rode up beside Silas as the stage door creaked open. Elias Vance climbed out slow, hat pulled low, a single traveling bag clutched against his chest like it might save him from something. When he saw Clara, his face went the color of ash. "Clara, sweet lord. Clara, what are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same." "Uncle, running off in the middle of the night with a single bag doesn't look like a man headed anywhere good." Elias's eyes darted to Silas, then back to his niece, and something in him seemed to break all at once, like a dam that had held too long against too much water. "I didn't have a choice," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Stone came to me 2 years ago, said he'd forgive the debt, said he'd even pay me on top of it if I'd just look the other way when certain papers came through the office. I told myself it was nothing. Filing errors, nobody's business. And the foreclosure on my well, was that nothing too? He threatened me, Clara. Said if I didn't sign it in your father's hand, he'd see to it I never worked in this county again. Or worse, I'm not a brave man. I never claimed to be. But I never wanted anyone hurt. People almost died because of that signature. Uncle Elias. A child was nearly taken hostage in front of my eyes because of that signature. Elias flinched like she had struck him, and in the lantern light, Clara could see how old he had gotten in just the last 2 years, how the fear had worn grooves into his face that had not been there before. Part of her wanted to feel sorry for him. A larger part could not forgive a man who let his fear cost other people their safety. I have the original ledger, she said, the real one, with the real signatures. I know what you've done, and I know why. But cowardice that puts children in danger isn't something I can simply forgive because it's family. What are you going to do? I'm going to stop Stone. Whether you help me or run from this the rest of your life is your choice to make. But I won't cover for you again. Elias stood in the dark road for a long moment, bag still clutched to his chest. And then slowly, he set it down. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a small bundle of papers, offering them to Clara with a hand that trembled visibly. This is everything, he said, every falsified deed, every forged transfer, going back 18 months. I kept copies, told myself it was insurance, in case Stone ever turned on me, too. I suppose some part of me knew this day was coming. Clara took the papers without a word. Behind her, Silas watched Elias with the careful, unreadable expression of a man weighing whether someone could be trusted and coming up without a clear answer. Get back on the stage, Clara said finally. Go wherever you were running to. I won't stop you, but you'll testify to what you just told me if it's ever needed. Or so help me. I will hunt you down myself. Elias nodded, climbing back into the coach without another word, as the driver snapped the reins and the stage rattled off into the dark. Clara stood in the road, holding the evidence that could unravel Malachi Stone's entire scheme, and felt no triumph in it at all, only a tired, hollow kind of sorrow for a man who had chosen fear over family. Silas dismounted and stood beside her. You did the right thing. Doesn't feel like it. Rarely does. She looked up at him, this quiet stranger who had ridden into her life on a dust storm and had not once asked for anything beyond $5 a day. How do you carry it? Doing hard things and never getting to feel good about them after. Silas was quiet a moment, staring off down the dark road where the stage had disappeared. You don't carry it alone if you're smart. That's the only trick I ever learned. They rode back to town in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settles between two people who have started, without quite meaning to, trusting each other with more than either one planned to give. Malachi Stone found them the next afternoon, standing in the middle of Main Street, like he owned every board of it, which in a practical sense he very nearly did. He was a broad man, silver-haired, dressed better than anyone had cause to dress in a cattle town, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told no and made it stick. Miss Vance, he said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. I hear you've been busy. Stagecoach robbery, was it? Word travels fast in a small county. It wasn't a robbery, Mr. Stone. It was a conversation with my uncle. You'd know all about those, I imagine, given how many people you've had conversations with about their debts. Stone's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind it. Careful, Miss Vance. A woman in your position should think twice about making enemies of powerful men. I'm not making an enemy of you, Mr. Stone. You did that yourself, the moment you decided a well and a schoolhouse full of orphaned children were worth stealing. A small crowd had begun to gather on the boardwalk, the way crowds do whenever the air turns tense enough to promise a story worth repeating later. Stone's gaze slid past Clara to Silas, standing a step behind her, and his smile widened into something with teeth in it. You know who you've hired to protect you, Miss Vance. Ask him about the Vulture Gang sometime. Ask him how many homesteaders he helped clear off good land back before he grew a conscience. Silas Thorne here used to do exactly what I'm doing now, except he did it with a rifle instead of a lawyer. The street went quiet. Clara felt the words land like a physical blow, though she kept her face still, refusing to give Stone the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Beside her, Silas had gone rigid, his jaw set, eyes fixed somewhere past Stone's shoulder, as though looking at something no one else in the street could see. "That true?" Clara asked him quietly. Once Stone had strolled off with his men trailing behind him, satisfied with the damage he had done. "It's true," Silas said. His voice had gone flat, stripped of anything she could read. "Rode with them 3 years, back after the war. Told myself it was just work, just following orders from men who paid on time. Took me too long to understand what we were really doing out there." "What changed your mind?" "A farmhouse, family inside it, refusing to leave land that had been theirs for 2 generations. My captain gave the order to burn them out." He stopped, and Clara watched something old and terrible move behind his eyes. "I didn't fire on that family, but I didn't stop the men who did, either. I just stood there and let it happen. And afterward I told myself standing still wasn't the same as pulling the trigger. Took me a long while to admit that it was." Clara said nothing for a long moment. Around them the street had emptied, gossip already spreading faster than either of them could outrun. "I left that night," Silas went on. "Been running from it ever since. One town to the next. Never staying long enough for anybody to look at me the way you're looking at me right now." "How am I looking at you?" "Like you're deciding whether to be afraid." Clara considered that, honestly considered it, because she owed him honesty, even if the answer might cost her his trust. "I'm not afraid of who you were, Mr. Thorne. I've seen who you are. A man who walked into a dust storm to save a child he'd never met, and never once asked for thanks. That tells me more than anything Malachi Stone could say in the street. But that night, the ghosts came for Silas anyway. Clara heard it from the small house behind the schoolhouse, where she had offered him a place to sleep. A low broken sound coming from the barn. Not quite a shout, and not quite a sob. Something caught painfully between the two. She lit a lamp and went out into the dark, following the sound past the horse stalls to where Silas sat against the far wall, his Colt drawn and gripped in both hands, finger resting white, knuckled against the trigger. His eyes were open, but seeing something else entirely. Some scene from years ago, playing out in front of him that no lamp could burn away. Sweat stood out on his forehead, despite the cold night air. His breathing came ragged and fast. Clara set the lamp down carefully outside the stall, out of the light's direct reach, understanding without being told that sudden brightness might do more harm than good. "Silas," she said softly. He did not answer. His hands trembled around the pistol grip, and for one terrible moment Clara thought he might not know her at all, might see nothing in front of him but the ghosts of that burning farmhouse, and the family he had failed to save. She stepped into the stall anyway. Every instinct told her it was dangerous. Walking toward a loaded gun, held by a man who was not fully present in his own mind. But she thought of him standing over her in the dust storm, of the trust he had shown by telling her the truth about the Vulture Gang, instead of letting her hear it only from Stone's mouth. And she understood that trust was something that had to be answered in kind, especially now, when it mattered most. She knelt down in front of him, slow, deliberate, no sudden movements. "It's Clara," she said. "You're at the schoolhouse. You're safe. Nobody here is going to hurt you. And you're not going to hurt anybody, either." His eyes flickered, some small recognition breaking through the haze, though his hands did not loosen on the gun. "I see the farmhouse," he said, voice barely a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it burning. I know." She reached out slowly and laid her hands over his, not pulling, not forcing, just resting there, warm against the cold metal and colder knuckles. "But that farmhouse isn't here anymore. You're here, with me," gently. So gently it took several long minutes. She guided his hands downward, the barrel drifting from where it had been pointed toward his own chest, down toward the straw-covered floor. He let her do it. Something in him recognized her touch as different from every other hand that had ever come near him in the dark, and he allowed himself, just this once, to be led instead of fighting alone. The gun finally rested against the floorboards. Silas's shoulders shook, the fight draining out of him all at once, replaced by something rawer and harder to watch, a grief that had waited 15 years to finally be witnessed by someone who did not flinch away from it. Clara did not speak. She simply stayed kneeling in front of him, her hand still over his, until his breathing slowed and the barn around them stopped being a battlefield in his mind and became, once more, just a barn. Quiet and smelling of hay and horses, with a lamp burning soft outside the stall door. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Don't be. You shouldn't have to see this." "Silas." She waited until he looked at her. Really looked. His eyes finally clear. "I saw a man walk out of a dust storm to save a stranger's child. I saw him tell me the truth about his past, instead of letting me hear a worse version from an enemy's mouth. And tonight, I see a man carrying scars he never asked for, doing his very best to survive them anyway. None of that makes me want to run. It makes me want to stay." He did not answer with words. He simply turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, and held on, the way a drowning man holds a rope he has finally stopped expecting to snap. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose boards of the barn. But inside, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one of them was afraid of the dark. The smell woke Clara before the sound did. Smoke, thick and wrong, curling in through the gap beneath her window. She was on her feet before she had fully finished dreaming, pulling a shawl over her nightdress, already moving toward the door when the first shout went up outside. "Fire! Schoolhouse is burning." She ran barefoot across the yard, the packed dirt cold under her feet, and stopped dead at the sight of it. Flames were already climbing the west wall of the schoolhouse, orange light licking up toward the roof, black smoke rolling off in a column thick enough to blot out the stars. Past it, a second glow. The clinic, Doc Joe's clinic, burning too. Silas was already moving, boots half-laced, rifle in hand, shouting names into the dark. "Clara, get the children out the north side, away from the wind." She did not ask questions. There was no time for questions. She ran for the small dormitory room where 6 of her students slept on cots, the ones with nowhere else to go, and began pulling them up by their arms, half awake and crying, herding them toward the door that faced away from the flames. "Hold hands," she told them, voice pitched to carry over the roar of the fire without cracking into panic. "Don't let go of each other. We're going to walk together, and we're going to be fine." She did not know if that last part was true. She said it anyway, because a lie that kept a child's feet moving was better than a truth that froze them in place. Outside, the night had turned into something out of a nightmare. Men on horseback moved through the smoke, and Clara understood in an instant that this was no accident, no stray spark from a cook fire. Malachi Stone's men had come in the dark to finish what the dust storm had failed to do. A gunshot cracked somewhere to her left, then another. Silas's voice, low and hard, giving orders to Doc Joe and her sister as they came stumbling out of the burning clinic with an armful of bandages and medicine bottles clutched against their chests. "This way," Silas called, and Clara followed his voice through the smoke, coughing, her eyes streaming, one hand gripping Tobias's small fingers, so tight she was afraid she might hurt him and unable to make herself loosen her grip even slightly. They made it to the well, the one solid thing in the whole yard that fire could not touch, and Silas positioned the children behind the stone lip of it, using the structure as cover. He had done this before, Clara realized, not fighting fire, fighting people who used fire as a weapon. There was a calm in him now that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with 15 years of training his body to keep working even when his mind screamed to run. "Stay down," he told the children. "Stay together." A rider came around the corner of the burning schoolhouse, torch still burning in one hand, and Silas raised his rifle without hesitation and put a shot through the man's shoulder. The rider dropped the torch and wheeled his horse away, cursing, disappearing back into the smoke and dark. Clara had never seen a man shot before. The sound of it, the wetness in the rider's cry of pain, made her stomach turn even as some colder part of her mind understood exactly why it had been necessary. "There's more of them," Silas said, reloading with hands that did not shake despite everything. "Stone wants this place gone tonight, one way or another. The children, I know. I need eyes on the road while I keep this side clear. Can you do that? Clara looked at the children huddled behind the well, then at the pistol Silas held out to her, taken from his belt, offered handle first. She had never fired a gun in her life. Her father had tried to teach her once, years ago, and she had hated the way it kicked in her hand, hated the noise of it, and had told him she would rather learn to read maps than learn to shoot. But her father was 3 years dead, and the well he had dug was on fire around her. And the 12 children who depended on that well for their entire future were watching her with wide, terrified eyes, waiting to see if the adults around them still had things under control. She took the gun. Point it and pull, Silas said. Don't think about it more than that. Not yet. Thinking comes later. She positioned herself at the edge of the well, watching the gap between the burning schoolhouse and the tree line where the road cut through. And for a long, terrible stretch of minutes, nothing happened at all except the crackling roar of the fire and the frightened breathing of children pressed close against the stone. Then a shape moved through the smoke on foot, circling wide of Silas's position, coming up on his blind side with a pistol already drawn. "Silas," Clara shouted. He spun, but the angle was wrong. The man too close, and Clara understood in the space of a single heartbeat that there was no time for him to bring his rifle around before the other man fired first. She raised the pistol Silas had given her. Her hand shook badly. She had never aimed at a living thing before in her life, had never wanted to, had built her entire existence around teaching children to read, instead of teaching them to fight. But she thought of Silas walking out of a dust storm to save Tobias, thought of him kneeling beside a burning building, keeping 12 orphan children alive with nothing but his own steady nerve. And she pulled the trigger before her mind could talk her out of it. The shot went wide of where she aimed, but close enough. It struck the man in the leg, and he went down with a scream, his own pistol firing harmlessly into the dirt as he fell. Silas turned, saw what had happened, and for one brief moment, their eyes met across the smoke and firelight. There was no time for words. Silas moved to secure the wounded man's weapon, while more shouting rose from the direction of the road. More riders circling back for another pass at the burning schoolhouse. It went on for the better part of an hour. Clara lost count of how many times she flinched at gunfire, how many times she pressed her body between the children and the chaos beyond the well, how many times she thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than the fire itself, that she might not survive this night. But slowly, gradually, the gunfire thinned. Stone's men had not expected this much resistance from a schoolteacher and a hired gun, had not counted on Silas Thorne's steady aim or Clara's stubborn refusal to fold under pressure. One by one, they broke off and retreated into the dark, leaving the schoolhouse and clinic to burn themselves out, rather than risk more losses. By the time the sky began to lighten with false dawn, both buildings had collapsed into smoking ruins. Clara sat on the ground beside the well, the pistol still loose in her lap, staring at the wreckage of everything she had built over the past 3 years. Silas sat down beside her, his own hands finally showing a slight tremor now that the danger had passed. "You saved my life tonight. I shot a man. You saved my life," he said again, firmer this time. "That's the whole of it. Don't let anybody, including yourself, turn it into something more complicated than that." Clara looked at her hands, still smudged with soot, and thought about the person she had been 3 years ago, a schoolteacher who could not stomach the idea of holding a gun. That person felt very far away now. "I don't regret it," she said slowly, testing the words as she said them. "I wish I hadn't needed to, but I don't regret it. That's the only way to carry it." Silas said, "Wish it different. Don't regret doing what had to be done." Around them, the children began to stir, gathering close, some crying quietly, some simply staring at the ruins in silence, too deep for tears. Clara pulled herself up and went to them, because whatever had happened to her that night, whatever line she had crossed, the children still needed a teacher who could tell them. Honestly, that morning would come and they would rebuild, and none of this had been their fault. We're going to be all right, she told them, gathering as many as she could into her arms at once. This building can burn, but what I taught you, what you carry in your own heads and hearts, nobody can burn that. Not Malachi Stone. Not anybody. It was, she realized, even as she said it, the truest thing she had ever told a room full of frightened children. And the first time she had ever needed to believe it quite so badly herself. They set up in an abandoned line shack 3 miles outside of town, a one-room structure that some long-forgotten rancher had built and left behind. Walls gone gray with weather, roof patched more than once by hands that were no longer around to patch it further. It was not much, but it was hidden. And after the fire, hidden mattered more than comfortable. Clara spread her maps across the single table inside, weighing down the corners with stones she had gathered from the yard. Years of careful surveying work covered the paper. Every well, every stream, every seasonal spring marked in her own careful hand. The product of countless hours spent walking the valley with a compass and a notebook long before Malachi Stone had ever set foot in the county. Show me, Silas said, standing over her shoulder. Clara traced a finger along the blue lines representing water. This is the aquifer. It runs beneath most of the valley, but it surfaces in only a handful of places. My well. 2 others on the Hutchins and Delgado properties. And this spring here, up near the ridge, which feeds the stock ponds for half the ranches in the county. She laid Elias's stolen documents beside the map, cross-referencing the property descriptions against her survey lines. Silas watched her work, the way she moved between numbers and geography, with the same fluency other people used for simple conversation. Here, she said finally, tapping a cluster of forged deeds. Stone hasn't just gone after my well. He's gone after every water source in the valley. The Hutchins foreclosure, the Delgado transfer, even the spring rights up on the ridge, which technically belong to the Comanche families who've used that water for longer than any of us have lived here. He's not just stealing a well, Silas said slowly, understanding dawning. He's cornering the whole valley's water, every drop of it. And once he owns it all, he controls who drinks, who waters their stock, who survives the next dry summer, and who doesn't. Clara sat back, the full scope of it settling over her like a physical weight. There's a railroad contract mentioned in 3 of these documents, a spur line planned to run straight through the valley. And whoever controls the water rights gets first pick of the land the railroad needs. Money, Silas said. All of it. For money, hundreds of people depend on this water. Silas, ranchers, homesteaders, the Comanche families up near the ridge who were here before any of us. If Stone succeeds, he doesn't just get rich. He drives all of them out. Or worse, he leaves them to die of thirst in a land that has plenty of water. Just none of it available to anyone who can't pay his price. Silas studied the maps a long while in silence, his mind working through the tactical shape of the problem the way he had once worked through battle plans. Except this time the stakes were not territory won or lost, but lives, plain and simple. We need more than the forged documents, he said finally. Stone's got money enough to make a judge doubt his own eyes if we're not careful. We need proof that can't be argued with. Witnesses, a paper trail nobody can dispute. I have an idea. Clara pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began sketching, her pen moving in quick, sure strokes. If I can get statements from the other ranchers whose land Stone has targeted, and combine them with the survey data showing how the aquifer actually flows, I can build a case that shows exactly what he's planning, not just theft of one well. A conspiracy to control an entire water system. That means visiting every ranch on this list. Yes, in country crawling with Stone's men. After they just burned down your schoolhouse. Clara looked up at him, chin lifted in a way he was coming to recognize as the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through every disaster Stone had thrown at her so far. Do you have a better idea? He did not, and they both knew it. Over the following days, they rode a wide circuit of the valley, visiting ranch after ranch under cover of dawn and dusk, avoiding the main roads where Stone's riders were most likely to patrol. Clara's reputation as the schoolteacher who had stood against Stone had spread faster than either of them expected, and most of the ranchers greeted her, not with suspicion, but with a kind of cautious hope. The look of people who had begun to believe no one was coming to help them, and were slowly realizing they might be wrong. At the Hutchins place, a weathered old rancher named Amos sat across his kitchen table from them, turning Clara's map over in gnarled hands. "Stone's boys came through here 2 months back," he said. "Told me the bank was calling my note due early. Wife and I scraped together everything we had, paid it off in full. Month later, a new notice comes, saying we still owe, this time twice as much. On account of some fee, nobody ever explained to my satisfaction." "Do you still have the paperwork?" Clara asked. Amos rose slowly and returned with a battered tin box, sliding it across the table. Inside, receipts, notices, correspondence going back over a year, each one a small piece of a much larger pattern. "I'll want these back," he said, "but you're welcome to copy whatever you need. If there's a way to stop that man, I want to be part of it." It went much the same at the Delgado Ranch, and again at 3 smaller homesteads scattered along the valley's edge. By the time they reached the ridge, where the Comanche families kept their traditional water rights, Clara's satchel had grown heavy with copied documents and sworn statements, a case built one honest voice at a time. The elder who met them at the ridge camp, a woman named Sister Owl, who had lived through more broken promises from white settlers than she cared to count, studied Clara for a long moment before speaking. "You want our word against this man, Stone?" "I want the truth told, ma'am, yours included. This valley's water was never meant to belong to one man alone." Sister Owl's gaze moved to Silas, taking in the rifle at his side. The careful way he stood, alert without being aggressive, watching the tree line out of old habit, rather than suspicion of the people in front of him. "You rode with the soldiers once," she said. "It was not a question." "I did," Silas answered. "Wasn't proud of what I did in that uniform, or after it, riding with worse men for worse reasons. I understand if that means my word carries no weight with your people. It means you understand something most white men never bother learning, that the taking of land and water is never a small thing, no matter how the paperwork tries to make it sound." Sister Owl was quiet a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I will speak for our people, and I will speak the truth. Not for you, for every family up and down this valley who has watched men like Stone decide who deserves to drink and who doesn't, by the time they rode back toward the line shack under a darkening sky." Clara's satchel held enough evidence to bury Malachi Stone many times over, if only they could find a judge honest enough to look at it. "We have the truth," Clara said, as they made camp for the night in a shallow draw well off the main road. "But truth alone hasn't stopped him yet." "Truth's a start," Silas said. "Getting it in front of the right eyes is the hard part. There's a circuit judge who comes through twice a year. Fair man, from what I've heard. Not beholden to Stone the way the local sheriff is. When's he due?" 3 weeks. Silas considered that, the fire crackling low between them, stars coming out thick and cold overhead. 3 weeks is a long time to keep this evidence safe, and you alive to present it. "I know." Clara pulled her shawl tighter against the night chill. "But it's what we have, and it's more than we had a week ago." Silas moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while neither of them spoke, watching the fire instead, each turning over the weight of what lay ahead. "Thank you," Clara said finally, "for riding with me through all this. You could have left after the first night, could have taken your $5 and ridden on to somewhere quieter." "Could have," he agreed. "Didn't want to." "Why not?" He was quiet a long moment, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. "Spent a long time believing the only thing left for me was running. Town to town, never staying, never letting anybody get close enough to ask questions I didn't want to answer. Then I watched you kneel in the dust for a boy you'd have died to protect. And I thought, maybe there's still something in this world worth standing still for." Clara looked at him across the firelight, and something passed between them that neither one tried to put into words just yet. It was enough. for that moment, simply to sit together beneath the stars. Two people who had each spent years believing themselves better suited to solitude, discovering slowly that they might have been wrong. The posse found their trail 2 days later, riding hard out of town with Stone's foreman at the lead. A dozen armed men fanned out across the valley floor in a search pattern, too organized to be anything but deliberate. Silas spotted the dust cloud from a rise a half-mile off and knew immediately what it meant. "They know we've got evidence," he said, already turning his horse toward the rougher country to the north. "Word's gotten back to Stone about our visits to the ranches." "Where do we go?" "Slot Canyon, up past the ridge, narrow enough that a small party can hold it against a larger one, if it comes to that. And hard enough to track through that, we might lose them before they figure out where we've gone." They rode hard through the afternoon, pushing the horses up into broken country where the trail narrowed to a thread between red rock walls, rising higher with every mile. By the time the light began to fail, they had reached a slot canyon barely 8 feet wide at its narrowest point, walls climbing 50 feet or more on either side. The sky reduced to a thin ribbon of deepening purple far overhead. "We hole up here," Silas said, dismounting to lead the horses the last stretch on foot. "Anybody comes through that opening, we'll hear them long before we see them." The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the canyon rim, the rock walls holding the day's heat only briefly before surrendering to a cold that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, teeth beginning to chatter despite her best efforts to hide it. Silas noticed anyway. He always noticed. He pulled off his heavy canvas duster and settled it over her shoulders without asking, the warmth of his own body still trapped in the fabric. "You'll freeze," Clara protested, even as she pulled the coat tighter around herself, grateful despite the objection. "Spent worse nights than this with less than I've got now. You keep it." He unrolled the single bedroll they had managed to bring and laid it out on the flattest patch of ground he could find, then settled himself against the canyon wall a short distance away, rifle across his knees, eyes on the narrow opening where anyone tracking them would have to come through. "You should sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch. You need rest too." "I'll manage." Clara lay down on the bedroll, but found sleep impossible, her mind turning over everything that had happened since the dust storm first carried Silas Thorne into her life. Every danger they had faced together. Every quiet moment that had passed between them in the spaces where danger briefly loosened its grip. After a long while, she gave up trying to sleep and sat up instead, watching him where he sat against the rock, his profile lit faintly by starlight. "Silas, thought you were sleeping." "I can't. Too cold, I think, or too much on my mind." He glanced at her, and something in his expression softened slightly, the hard watchfulness easing just a fraction. "Come sit closer, if you want. No sense both of us freezing separately when we could freeze together and call it practical." She managed a small laugh despite everything and moved to sit beside him, close enough to share warmth, his duster still wrapped around her shoulders. For a while they simply sat in silence, listening to the wind move high overhead where it could not reach them, watching the thin strip of stars visible between the canyon walls. It was Clara who finally noticed the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt, visible even in poor light, once she looked closely enough. "You're hurt." "Graze. Nothing serious." "Let me see it." He hesitated. Old habits of hiding his wounds from anyone who might use them against him, warring with the newer, stranger instinct to let this particular person close enough to help. In the end, the newer instinct won, and he shrugged out of the shoulder of his shirt, enough for her to examine the wound by the faint starlight. A shallow furrow along his upper arm, where a bullet had passed close during the fire, but not close enough to do serious damage. Beneath it and around it, she saw the rest for the first time in full, scars crossing his back in a pattern that told its own terrible history. Some thin and old, whip marks from some punishment long past, others thicker, the unmistakable puckered marks left by bullets that had found their target over the years. A map of every violent turn his life had taken, written directly into his skin. Clara did not ask questions. She understood, somehow, that this was not a story that needed telling in words. Not tonight. Not under these particular stars. Instead, she reached for the canteen tied to her saddle and tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat and began cleaning the fresh wound with a gentleness that spoke louder than any question could have. "You don't have to do that," Silas said quietly. "I know," she continued anyway, her touch careful along the edges of the wound, the water cold but her hands steady. "I want to." He sat very still beneath her hands, a man who had spent a lifetime flinching away from touch, learning in real time that not every hand reaching toward him carried harm in it. When she finished, tying off the makeshift bandage as best she could manage, he caught her hand before she could pull away, holding it loosely against his uninjured shoulder. "Nobody's done that for me," he said. "Not since I was young enough not to remember it clearly. Then I'm glad I could." They sat like that a long while, her hand still resting against him, neither one in any hurry to break the quiet that had settled between them. Above the canyon walls, the stars wheeled slowly through their long night's arc, indifferent to the two people below who had, in their own careful way, begun to trust each other with more than either had planned. "I used to think being alone was the safest way to live," Silas said eventually. "Nobody to lose. Nobody to lose you. Simplest math there is. And now I think maybe safety was never really the point. Maybe surviving something worth surviving matters more than surviving nothing at all." Clara turned to look at him fully, and in the pale light his face had lost some of its usual careful guardedness, replaced by something rawer and more honest than she had yet seen from him. "I used to think I had to carry everything alone, too," she said. "The school, the well, my father's memory. I thought asking for help was its own kind of failure." She paused. "You've taught me otherwise, these past weeks, whether you meant to or not. Wasn't trying to teach you anything. I know. That's usually how the best lessons happen. Nobody's standing at a chalkboard. Just two people getting through something hard together and coming out the other side having learned something neither one set out to learn." Silas studied her for a long moment, and then slowly, carefully, as though giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. Nothing more than that. A gesture of gratitude and something deeper neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. "Get some rest," he said softly. "I'll keep watch till the moon sets. Nothing's coming through that canyon mouth without me hearing it first." Clara settled against his uninjured side, still wrapped in his duster. And for the first time since the fire had taken her schoolhouse, she slept deeply and without dreams, secure in the knowledge that whatever came through the darkness beyond the canyon walls, she would not face it alone. Dawn found the posse's trail moving on past the canyon mouth without ever pausing to search its narrow depths, the dust of their passing visible far off across the valley floor as the sun rose. Silas woke Clara gently once the danger had passed, and together they broke camp in the thin morning light, 3 weeks still standing between them and the circuit judge who might, if fortune held, finally bring Malachi Stone's long reign to its end. But something had shifted between them in that cold canyon, something neither one needed words to confirm. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that alone had changed the shape of everything ahead. Word of the marshal's arrival spread through town before he had even dismounted. Clara heard it from Doc Joe, who came running to the line shack with her skirts hiked up past her ankles, breathless from the ride. "Federal marshals in town," Joe said. "Rode in this morning, badge and all. Says he's investigating irregularities in the county land office." Clara felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in weeks, a hope she had not allowed herself to fully feel since the schoolhouse burned. Someone finally listened. "Maybe," Silas said, but there was no matching relief in his voice. He stood near the shack's single window, watching the road as he had watched it every day since the fire, old habits refusing to rest even now. "You don't trust it." "I don't trust anything I haven't looked at close." Not with what's at stake. He glanced at her. But if he's the real thing, this could end it. Judge won't be needed if a marshal's already building a federal case. They rode into town that afternoon. Clara's satchel heavy with 3 weeks of gathered evidence. Forged deeds and sworn statements and her own careful survey maps showing exactly how Malachi Stone had built his scheme to swallow the valley's water one deed at a time. The marshal had set up in the back room of the sheriff's office, a broad-shouldered man with a gray mustache and a manner that struck Clara as reassuringly plain. No flourish to him, no performance. "Miss Vance," he said, rising to shake her hand. "Marshal Ezra Colton. I've heard some of what's been happening out here. Forged deeds, a schoolhouse burned, a valley's worth of water rights, disappearing into one man's pocket. I intend to get to the bottom of it. I have documentation," Clara said, setting her satchel on his desk. Statements from a dozen ranchers, survey records showing the aquifer's true boundaries, and copies of the forged deeds themselves, along with testimony from the man who forged them. Colton paged through the materials with what looked like genuine interest, nodding slowly, asking sharp questions that suggested a mind well-suited to unraveling exactly this kind of conspiracy. Clara found herself relaxing slightly as the conversation went on, the tension of the past 3 weeks beginning. Cautiously, to ease, Silas stood near the doorway throughout the meeting, saying little, watching everything. It was there, in the last few minutes before they left, that he noticed it. Colton had risen to see them out, and as he did, his right hand drifted to the holster at his hip, fingers tapping out a small, rhythmic sequence against the leather. Once, twice, a third time, unconscious as breathing. Silas had seen that exact motion before, years ago, around a campfire with men who called themselves the Vulture Gang, men who had developed the habit as a kind of silent signal among themselves, a way of marking who belonged and who did not. Back when they rode together, clearing homesteaders off land that belonged, on paper, to men just like Malachi Stone. He said nothing until they were well clear of the sheriff's office. Walking their horses slow down the main street. "We can't trust him." Clara stopped walking. "What are you talking about?" He seemed thorough, careful, exactly the kind of man we need. He tapped his holster 3 times while we were leaving. Ring finger, same rhythm, same hand. That's a Vulture Gang signal. I haven't seen it in years, but I'd know it in my sleep. Man's been paid off. Clara, same as the sheriff, same as half this county. Clara felt the hope she had been carrying since morning drain out of her all at once, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. "You're certain? Certain enough that I'm not leaving that evidence in his hands another hour." They turned back toward the sheriff's office, moving faster now, but they were too late. Colton stood on the boardwalk with 2 of his deputies, and behind them, unmistakable even at a distance, Malachi Stone himself, arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed the game was already won. "Miss Vance," Colton called out, "I'm afraid I'll need you to come back inside. Some irregularities in your own paperwork that need clearing up. There's nothing irregular about the truth. Marshal? That's a matter for a federal judge to decide. In the meantime, I'll be taking that evidence into official custody." His hand rested, deliberately this time, on the grip of his pistol. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Silas stepped between Clara and the men on the boardwalk, his own hand near his rifle, though he made no move to draw it yet. "Evidence stays with us." Stone's voice carried across the street, dripping with satisfaction. "Should have known you'd recognize an old friend when you saw one. Marshal Colton here rode with the Vulture Gang, same years you did. Small world, isn't it?" The truth of it settled over Clara like a physical weight. The law itself, the one institution she had believed might still stand above Stone's reach, had been bought and paid for just like everything else in the county. There was no federal justice coming to save them. There was only this, one more armed confrontation in a town that had seen too many already. "Get to the horses," Silas said quietly, not taking his eyes off Colton. Now Clara did not argue. She backed toward where they had tied their mounts, satchel clutched tight against her chest, while Silas, kept himself positioned between her and the men on the boardwalk. Colton's hand tightened on his pistol grip, deputies fanning out to either side. And for one long, breathless moment, the entire street seemed to hold still, waiting to see which way the violence would break. Then Clara was in the saddle, and Silas was swinging up behind her onto his own horse. And the moment shattered into motion. Colton shouted an order. A shot rang out, splintering the hitching post beside them, and Silas spurred his horse hard down the street, Clara close behind. Both of them bent low over their horses' necks as more shots followed, wild and hurried, fired by men who had not expected their quarry to run quite so fast. They cleared the edge of town within minutes, but the sound of pursuit followed close behind, hoofbeats thundering on the hard-packed road. Colton and his deputies giving chase with Stone's own riders, joining in somewhere behind them. The canyons, Silas shouted over the wind. We can lose them in the rock country, same as before. Clara knew the terrain better than anyone in the valley. Every fold and draw memorized from years of careful surveying, and she called out directions as they rode, guiding them off the main road and into a maze of red rock formations where a smaller, faster party could outmaneuver a larger, clumsier one. But their pursuers knew the country too, or knew it well enough to follow. And the chase stretched on through the afternoon, in and out of narrow canyons, across open stretches where every second in the open was a second of exposed danger. Clara felt the wind tearing at her hair, felt her heart hammering against her ribs, and understood with a clarity that frightened her how close they were riding to death itself. It was near dusk, as they cut hard around a rocky outcrop with Colton's men closing the gap behind them, that Clara heard Silas grunt in pain, his body jolting in the saddle. Silas, keep riding, he ground out. But she could see the dark stain already spreading along his thigh, a rifle bullet having found its mark despite the speed and the poor light. Don't stop. She did not stop, though every instinct screamed at her to turn back and help him. She led them deeper into the rock country, using every fold of terrain she knew from her surveying work, until finally, as full dark settled over the canyons, the sound of pursuit began to fade behind them. Their pursuers either lost in the maze of rock or unwilling to press the chase into full darkness. They found a hidden overhang to shelter in, and Clara helped Silas down from his horse, his leg buckling the moment his weight came onto it. Blood soaked through his trouser leg, dark and steady in the fading light. Let me see it, she said, already reaching for the bandages in her saddlebag, hands moving with a steadiness that surprised her, even as fear for him roared beneath the surface of her calm. Bullets still in there, Silas said, through gritted teeth, as she cut away the fabric to examine the wound. Went in high on the thigh. Missed the bone, I think, or I wouldn't still be sitting up talking to you. We need Doc Joe. Can't risk the town. Not with Colton and Stone, both looking for us there. Clara worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could with what little she had, packing it and binding it tight to slow the bleeding. Her hands shook, but she did not let the shaking slow her work, drawing on the same steady focus that had carried her through every disaster since the dust storm first brought this man into her life. You're going to be all right, she told him, though she was not entirely certain it was true. Wasn't planning on dying tonight, Silas said, managing a weak, pained smile. Got too much left to do. Clara looked at him in the gathering dark, this man who had bled to protect her, who had ridden with a bullet in his leg rather than slow their escape, and felt something settle in her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a certainty she had been building toward for weeks now, one dangerous night at a time. We're going back, she said, not to hide, to finish this. Clara, Stone burned my school. Bought the law meant to stop him. Nearly got you killed twice now. I am done running from that man. Silas Thorne, tomorrow we go back, and we end this, once and for all. Silas studied her for a long moment in the dim light. Pain etched across his face, but something else there too, a fierce and steady pride that had nothing to do with the wound in his leg. All right, he said finally, then we end it. They rode back into town at dawn, Silas's leg bound tight and useless for anything but standing. His rifle steady in his hands despite the pain that must have been screaming through him with every movement. Clara had wanted him to rest, had argued for it half the night, but he had simply shaken his head and said some fights could not wait for a man's body to catch up to his will. Doc Joe met them at the edge of town, alerted by Joe's sister that trouble was coming, and together, the three of them, along with a handful of ranchers who had signed Clara's sworn statements and now stood ready to back their word with action, began turning the quiet main street into something closer to a battlefield than anyone had wanted it to become. Stone won't come alone, Silas said, positioning barrels and wagons at angles across the street to break up sight lines. He'll bring every gun he's got left, and Colton's men besides. We need cover, and we need it to favor us, not them. The livery stable roof gives a clear line down most of the street, Amos Hutchins said. The old rancher, who had ridden in with three of his own hired hands, once word reached him of what was coming. I can put a man up there. Not a man, Clara said. Silas turned to look at her, and for a moment the old instinct to protect her from every possible danger warred visibly across his face. But he had learned enough these past weeks not to argue with her when her jaw set that particular way, and instead he nodded slowly. You know the water tower's supports, he asked, the old wooden ones, holding up the tank at the end of the street. I surveyed them myself 2 years back, when the town wanted an assessment before repairs. They're rotted through on the north side. Been meaning to warn the council about it for months. Could you bring it down, if you had to, with a rifle shot? Clara looked down the street at the massive wooden water tower looming over the far end of town, its tank holding thousands of gallons. Its supports exactly as weathered and fragile as she remembered. Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. If Stone's men are gathered beneath it when it falls, she said, the flood would wash out anyone caught in the open. That's the idea. They spent the remaining hours of morning preparing, every rancher in hand who had come to stand with them, finding a position. Every window and doorway along the main street becoming a piece of the trap they were building. Doc Joe set up a triage station in the sheriff's abandoned office, the sheriff himself having wisely made himself scarce once word spread of what was coming. By midday, word reached them that Stone was gathering his full force at the edge of town, Marshal Colton and his deputies riding at his side, a dozen armed men prepared to finish what 3 weeks of failed intimidation had not managed to accomplish. Clara climbed to the livery stable roof with her rifle and a box of cartridges, positioning herself where she could see the full length of the main street below, the water tower looming close on her left. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they had been that first terrible night during the fire. 3 weeks of hard necessity having taught her body what her mind still struggled to fully accept. Down in the street, Silas took up a position near the center of town, leaning on a support post to keep the weight off his wounded leg. Rifle held ready, waiting. Malachi Stone rode into town at the head of his men just past noon, the sun high and merciless overhead, dust rising behind the column of riders, like something out of a bad dream repeating itself. Marshal Colton rode at his side, badge gleaming, the two of them radiating the confidence of men who believed the outcome of this confrontation had already been decided in their favor. They stopped at the edge of the main street, taking in the barricades, the positioned wagons, the empty windows that were not nearly as empty as they appeared. Thorn, Stone called out, reining his horse to a stop 100 yards distant. You're a stubborn man. Should have ridden on when you had the chance, weeks ago. Would have saved everyone a great deal of trouble. Should have, Silas called back, voice carrying clear and steady down the empty street. Didn't want to. That evidence you've been collecting means nothing now. Marshal Colton here is prepared to declare it fraudulent, produced under duress. Whatever story serves the moment. You've got nothing left, Thorn. Just a bad leg and a schoolteacher's stubbornness standing between you and a very short future. Funny thing about stubbornness, Silas said. It's outlasted better men than you. Stone, figure it'll outlast you too. Stone's patience, never deep to begin with, ran out entirely at that. He gave a sharp gesture, and his men began fanning out along the street, moving toward the barricades with weapons drawn, while Colton and two of his deputies advanced more directly down the center of the road toward where Silas stood waiting. The first shots came from Stone's men testing the barricades, answered immediately by the ranchers positioned in doorways and windows along the street. The main street of the quiet town erupted into chaos, gunfire cracking from a dozen directions at once, dust and gunsmoke rising to blur the already harsh midday light. Clara watched from the livery roof, tracking the movement of Stone's men as they pressed forward, watching for the moment when enough of them would be gathered beneath the water tower to make her shot count. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. 3 weeks of hard lessons, settling into something that felt, for the first time, almost like confidence. Below, Colton had closed to within 30 yards of Silas, his deputies fanning wide to flank him. Silas stood his ground despite the wound in his leg, rifle steady, eyes never leaving the marshal's face. Last chance to walk away. Colton called out, "Old friend to old friend. We were never friends." Colton. Just two men who once made the same mistake of following the wrong orders. I found my way out of it. Seems you never did. Colton's hand moved toward his holster. Silas was faster. Years of hard survival honed into reflexes that pain and fatigue could not fully dull. And his shot took the marshal square in the chest before the man's own pistol had fully cleared its holster. Colton dropped without a sound, badge glinting once in the sunlight before he hit the dust. The two deputies, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran rather than press the fight further, disappearing back down a side street in a scramble that owed nothing to loyalty and everything to simple survival instinct. That left Malachi Stone, still mounted at the edge of town, watching his carefully built scheme collapse in real time around him. He drew his own pistol, urging his horse forward, but Silas turned his rifle on him before he had covered half the distance. "Drop it," Silas called out. "I'd rather see you shackled than shot, but I'll settle for either." It was in that exact moment that Clara saw her opening. A cluster of Stone's remaining men had retreated toward the water tower for cover, exactly the position she had hoped for, exactly the moment she had been waiting 3 tense hours to see. She raised her rifle, sighted along the rotted north support she had identified in her survey 2 years before, and fired. The old wood, weakened by years of weather and neglect, gave way with a groan that carried over even the chaos of the gunfight below. The massive tank tilted, then collapsed entirely, sending thousands of gallons of water crashing down into the street in a sudden, violent flood that swept Stone's remaining gunmen off their feet and scattered them. Weapons lost. Fight thoroughly drowned out of them, down the muddy street. In the sudden, startled quiet that followed, Silas advanced on Malachi Stone, who sat his horse in stunned disbelief at the flood that had just ended his entire scheme in a matter of seconds. "It's over, Stone," Silas said. "Drop the gun." Stone's eyes flicked to the wreckage of the water tower, to his scattered and disarmed men, to the ranchers emerging from their positions along the street with weapons still trained on him. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes finally landed on the only answer available to him. He let his pistol fall into the mud. Clara climbed down from the livery roof on legs that had gone suddenly weak now that the danger had passed, her ears still ringing from the gunfire, her whole body shaking with the release of tension that had been building for 3 long weeks. She made her way down the flooded street to where Silas stood over Stone, rifle steady, despite the blood still seeping through the bandage on his thigh. "You held him at gunpoint instead of finishing it," she said, understanding without needing to ask why. "Killing him would be easy," Silas said, "be over in a second, and maybe feel like justice for about that long. But real justice needs a judge, a courtroom, a record that outlasts both of us. That's the kind of ending this valley deserves. Not one more body in the dirt, in the distance. Faint, but growing steadily louder. came the whistle of an approaching train. Carrying with it, Clara knew from the schedule she had memorized weeks ago, the honest circuit judge who would finally see justice done properly, on the record, in a way that could never again be bought or burned away. The circuit judge, a sharp-eyed man named Harlan Reyes, who had built his reputation on refusing every bribe ever offered him in 20 years on the bench, spent 3 full days reviewing the evidence Clara had gathered. He interviewed Amos Hutchins and the Delgado family, took careful testimony from Sister Owl regarding the Ridge Spring rights, and cross-referenced every forged deed against Clara's original survey maps with the same patient thoroughness she herself had brought to uncovering the conspiracy in the first place. At the end of it, sitting in the makeshift courtroom set up in the town hall, he delivered his ruling in a voice that carried the weight of undeniable fact. Every foreclosure and transfer connected to Malachi Stone's water acquisition scheme is hereby declared null and void, the products of forgery and coercion, unsupported by any legitimate legal standing. He looked over his spectacles at Stone, seated in shackles at the front of the room. Mr. Stone, you are remanded to federal custody to be transported for trial on charges of forgery, arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Given the scope of evidence presented, I expect the federal penitentiary will be your home for a great many years to come. Stone said nothing as the deputies led him from the room, his silver hair disheveled, his confidence finally thoroughly broken. Clara watched him go and felt no triumph in it, only a quiet, settling relief. The particular exhaustion that comes after a long fight finally reaches its end. The valley's water rights, Judge Reyes continued, addressing the packed room of ranchers and homesteaders who had come to hear the ruling, are restored in full to their rightful owners, as documented in Miss Vance's survey records. This court further recognizes the traditional water rights of the Comanche families at the Ridge Spring, which shall not be subject to any future claim, absent their explicit consent. A murmur of relief and quiet celebration moved through the room. Clara felt Silas's hand find hers beneath the table where they sat, his grip steady, despite the crutch propped against his chair, and she held on tight, letting herself finally believe that the fight really was over. The weeks that followed brought a kind of healing to the valley that no single ruling could have accomplished alone. Ranchers, who had lived for months under the shadow of Stone's forged foreclosures, began rebuilding what fear had made them neglect. The Comanche families returned openly to the Ridge Spring for the first time in years without worry of harassment, and in the center of town, where the old schoolhouse had once stood before fire, reduced it to ash. A new structure began slowly rising from the ground up, built with lumber donated by grateful ranchers and labor volunteered by hands that understood exactly what the school had meant to the valley's future. Silas's leg healed slower than either of them would have liked, the bullet having done more damage than first believed, leaving him with a limp that Doc Joe told him plainly would likely never fully fade. Not the kind of scar most men would want to carry, she told him, during one of his final checkups. Seen worse scars carry worse meanings, Silas said. This one, I don't mind so much. He meant it. The limp was a permanent reminder of a night when he had chosen to stand and fight rather than run. A physical marker of the moment he had finally stopped believing himself unworthy of a place to belong. He found he could live with that particular scar more easily than he had ever expected. On the day the new schoolhouse was finished, the whole valley turned out to see it. Ranchers and homesteaders, and the children themselves, gathered in the bright morning sun to watch Clara cut the ribbon across the front door. Sister Owl stood among the crowd, along with Amos Hutchins and the Delgado family, and even Doc Joe's sister had closed the telegraph office early to attend. Inside, the desks were new, built over the preceding weeks by Silas himself, working slow and careful around his healing leg, sanding each surface smooth enough that no splinter would ever catch a child's hand. It was not fast work, given his injury, but it was steady, patient work, the kind that suited a man learning. Finally, How to build instead of only ever having learned how to tear down. Clara found him in the empty schoolhouse that evening. After the crowds had gone home and the last of the celebration had quieted into the ordinary hush of dusk settling over the valley, he stood in the warm, slanted light coming through the new windows, running a hand along the surface of the last desk he had finished, checking it one final time for any rough edge he might have missed. "You did good work," she said, standing in the doorway. "Figured it was time I built something instead of only ever breaking things." He looked up at her, and something in his face had changed since that first day in the dust storm. Some old hardness worn away by weeks of trust slowly, carefully earned. "This place matters. Wanted it to be built right. It is, every bit of it." Clara crossed the room to stand beside him, her hand finding his over the smooth surface of the desk. "The children start lessons Monday. 12 of them again. Same as before. Maybe more. Once word spreads that the well's safe and the school's rebuilt. You'll teach them well. We'll teach them well," she corrected gently. "You've got as much claim to this place now as I do." Silas was quiet a moment, looking around the schoolhouse at the rows of desks he had built. The chalkboard mounted fresh on the far wall, the windows letting in the last warm light of a day that had finally, after so many hard weeks, ended in something like peace. "Never thought I'd end up somewhere like this," he said. "Building desks instead of trouble. Man like me. A man like you built this room with his own 2 hands. Silas Thorne, taking care with every single piece of it. That tells me exactly what kind of man you actually are. Whatever kind of man you used to believe yourself to be." He turned to look at her fully then, and whatever words might have followed seemed unnecessary in the face of everything already understood between them. 3 months of shared danger and shared trust. Having built something sturdier than either of them had believed themselves capable of building again after everything they had separately survived. Before finding each other. "I locked the gun belt away this morning," he said, "in the chest, back at the house. Figured a man building a schoolhouse doesn't need it hanging at his hip every waking hour anymore. Does that frighten you?" "Setting it down. Some. Spent a long time believing the gun was the only thing keeping me alive." He looked around the schoolhouse once more, taking in everything they had built together, out of fire and loss and hard-won trust. "But I think maybe I found something better, worth staying alive for. Something a gun was never going to protect anyway. Not really." Outside, the valley settled into evening, the sky over the ridge burning slow shades of orange and gold. The well behind the schoolhouse, pumping clean water once more for children who would grow up knowing, in a way few children ever truly learn, that a home worth having is a home worth standing and fighting to keep. Clara stood in the doorway of her new schoolhouse, a ledger of new student enrollments tucked under one arm, and watched Silas move slowly through the room he had built, checking each desk one final time with the careful attention of a man who had finally found work worth doing with his hands. Whatever scars either of them carried forward from the long fight behind them, the valley itself was healing, water flowing free again to every family who needed it. A schoolhouse, dense strong against whatever storms might come next. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of ending worth all the dust and fire it had taken to earn. In the end, this was never only a story about a schoolhouse, a well, or a valley caught beneath the shadow of a powerful man. It was a story about what people choose to protect when everything they love is threatened. Clara Vance did not begin as a warrior. She was a teacher, a woman who believed in maps, books, children, and the quiet promise that knowledge could give forgotten lives a future. But when Malachi Stone tried to take the well, burn the school, and frighten an entire valley into silence, Clara learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is standing with shaking hands and still saying, "No more," and Silas Thorne, the haunted gunslinger who walked out of the dust storm, teaches us another truth. A person's past may explain their scars, but it does not have to decide their future. He had once run from guilt, violence, and memories he could not bury. Yet beside Clara, he found a reason to stop running and start building. That is one of the deepest lessons of this story. Redemption is not found in words alone. It is found in what we choose to do after we finally understand the harm we have caused or the pain we have carried. Silas could not erase the man he had been, but he could become the man who protected children, stood beside the innocent, and built desks for a new schoolhouse with his own hands. Clara could not undo the fire that destroyed everything she had built, but she could gather the children, protect the truth, and rebuild something stronger from the ashes. Their journey reminds us that evil often wins at first because good people feel alone. Stone controlled the law, the money, the riders, and the fear of the town. But he lost when ordinary people stopped believing they were powerless. A teacher, a wounded gunslinger, a doctor, ranchers, families, and witnesses all became stronger together than one corrupt man with all his threats. That is the value this story leaves behind. Truth may be fragile when held by one person, but when a community carries it together, it becomes something no fire can burn and no gun can silence. The well in this story is more than water. It is life, dignity, education, and the right of every family to survive without begging permission from the powerful. The schoolhouse is more than wood and walls. It is hope. It is proof that children who were forgotten by the world still deserved a place to learn, to dream, and to believe they mattered. And maybe that is why Clara fought so hard. She was not fighting for land alone. She was fighting for the future. She was fighting for every child who had been told they were nothing. She was fighting for every honest family that had been pushed aside by greed. She was fighting for the simple idea that no man, no matter how rich or feared, has the right to own another person's hope. Silas's transformation also carries a powerful message for anyone who has ever felt too broken to begin again. Sometimes the world remembers only our worst chapter. Sometimes we remember only our own failures. But healing begins when someone sees not just what we did, but what we are still capable of becoming. Clara saw the truth in Silas before he could fully see it in himself. She did not excuse his past, but she also did not chain him to it forever. And in return, Silas showed her that accepting help is not weakness. Even the strongest heart needs someone to stand beside it when the storm comes. Their love was not born from easy days or pretty promises. It was built in dust, fire, fear, sacrifice, and trust. That is why it feels real. Because real love does not only ask, will you stay when life is beautiful? Real love asks, will you stand with me when everything falls apart? By the end, when the schoolhouse rises again and clean water flows through the valley, the story gives us a quiet but powerful answer. What is destroyed by cruelty can be rebuilt by courage. What is stolen by greed can be restored by truth. And what is broken inside a person can still become useful, gentle, and good. So if this story stays with you, let it be because of this. You do not have to be fearless to do what is right. You do not have to be perfect to be redeemed. And you do not have to face the storm alone. Sometimes one brave choice, one honest voice, or one person willing to stand in the dust can change the fate of an entire valley. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If Clara and Silas's journey moved you, stay with us for the next tale, because somewhere beyond the ridge, another heart is waiting to be tested.